So I'm here today with Bill Plotkin. Bill, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Brian.
Well, it might help if I give a little background as to how I found your work.
Okay.
Might help orient us here. So it's probably over 20 years ago that I was introduced to Robert Moore's book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which was a kind of Bible of the men's movement in the 1990s. And a lot of the men's groups are still using it as a reference or guidebook. And when I started doing coaching and counseling work with people a few years ago, I revisited that book because I had a lot of men coming to me. And I remember that book being helpful to me in terms of just kind of sorting myself out and understanding my kind of undeveloped potentials. And I revisited it and I found, in some ways it felt quite dated. And I wasn't totally comfortable using that book in my work, but I've experimented with it and some guys have picked up on it. But I started to think about developing my own model of the psyche that would help orient people. And in doing that, I was searching around, seeing if anyone else was doing this kind of work. And I found Angeles Arrien's book, The Fourfold Way, which is a beautiful little book, but again, kind of dated. It appropriates a lot of Native American culture and uses the medicine wheel as the model and things like that, which I find a little problematic these days. And people had been recommending your work to me over the years. They'd come to a workshop or class and they'd hear what I was interested in and what my mission was in the work that I do. And they say, well, you should check out Bill Plotkin. And, I kind of knew about you on the periphery, but I always figured that you were like a rites of passage guy, a vision quest guy. I thought that's what you were doing. And I thought, well, I find that stuff interesting, but it's not really what I'm looking for. But recently, as I was doing some research on maps and models of the psyche and developmental models, I found some diagrams of things that you had produced over the years in your earlier books. I said, oh, this seems like it's about a lot more than rites of passage or, initiatory weekend work, that kind of stuff. And so I picked up Wild Mind and I found that you had developed a map of the psyche in your own way. And a lot of it really resonated with me. And I love how you put in the context of like the global crisis, like what kind of humans do we need in our world at this time to address the concerns of this time. So I really appreciated that, and that led me just to kind of explore your work and see that you're a practicing psychotherapist, you had a Jungian background or depth psychological background, so lots of resonances there. And when your new book came out, I just thought, wow, this is really interesting because the model I'd been developing, I was calling the four initiations. And your book is called The Journey of Soul Initiation. So my ears immediately perked up. And I thought, well, I got to talk to this guy. I got to see what's what the book is about and what his work is about. And so I'm excited to have you here so that I can explore a little more deeply the nature of your work and particularly the topics you address in the new book. So
Great. Yeah. Excited to.
yeah, maybe a place to start for anyone who's not familiar with your work is if you could just let us know a little bit about the work that you do at the Animas Valley Institute.
Yeah. We have, just as general background, we have about 20 guides and maybe 100 trainees, and we're offering programs in 15 or so countries around the world and have been doing this work for 40 years. And most generally, our work is about human development, nature-based and soul-centric human development. So I've been asking for about 40 years this question of what is a mature human, and what are the kinds of communities or cultural settings that support people to truly mature, to become fully human. And starting in the early years, it became increasingly evident to me that our contemporary Western culture. And in fact, most of the large population cultures around the world now do not support true human maturity anymore. Not only are there relatively few elders, true elders, there's actually relatively few true adults. And that was a radical conclusion for me to come to for myself as well as for others. And I ended up concluding that in the Western world, for sure, it's been thousands of years since we've had intact cultural forms for truly maturing human beings. Some Western humans manage to mature anyways without cultural support, but it's relatively few. So at Animas Valley Institute, in the biggest scope, what we're doing is helping people develop what we call the 4 facets of human wholeness, which we're all born with the seed of those 4 facets, but our societies tend not to support the development of any of them and suppress at least 2 of them quite actively. And secondly, through the resources that we develop or cultivate through the 4 facets of wholeness, we can engage in what we call self-healing. We're able to heal our own woundedness, which I've come to discover is a much deeper and more lasting form of healing than when we're healed by somebody else. So many people in the Western world are not capable of engaging in self-healing because they haven't cultivated their facets of wholeness. So thank God for talented healers, psychotherapists, and so on. But a primary work is what at Animas Valley Institute is the journey of soul initiation, which is enabled once people have done enough of their foundational holding and self-healing work. And it's a journey, the journey of soul initiation, that a person can't begin until they reach a stage of life that isn't even on the maps of Western psychology. I know what I'm speaking about because I am a Western trained psychologist. And most people in the Western world, 80 to 90%, never reach the stage of life where the journey of soul initiation can begin. But it's actually not that hard actually to reach it. We found that with the support of practices for cultivating wholeness and for self-healing, people can reach this stage of life, which I call the cocoon stage. So our primary work, which we call Soulcraft, or the journey of soul initiation, or the descent to soul, are for those 10 to 20% of humans who are ready for this descent to soul, which is an experience where we find our deepest belonging and our deepest purpose and meaning in life. But it's not what most people think it is, because most people think in terms of, when it comes to purpose or meaning, think in terms of like my social role or my vocation or career and so on. But soul initiation is a process of several years. It's not a weekend rite of passage. You're right about that. It's a process of several years that enables us to discover what we sometimes call the truth at the center of the image we were born with. And this is an old idea, actually, that we're each born to take a particular place, not just in the human community, but the more than human community, the larger Earth community. And another way to say that is that each of us has a unique niche in the larger ecology that we are born to take. And so we call that our unique ecological niche. And that's actually what I've ended up meaning by the word soul. It's our unique place, our ultimate place in the world. And we're born with it, but we have to go through this developmental sequence where we forget it very early in life. And then we learn how to be a social creature in our particular cultural setting. And then once we've succeeded at that, and that's what's so hard for contemporary people, but to truly succeed at, at feeling a deep belonging socially and possibly vocationally, um, then mystery, I like to say, moves us into this next stage of life where we're heading down to the depths to find, to recover, you could say, the that mystery, that unique place in the world we were born to take.
Okay. Well, that's quite an overview.
Yeah,
So maybe I could just pick up a few of those threads
good.
and we could take a look at them. So, the first thing, if you could talk a little bit about those four facets of wholeness that you mentioned. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that book. What's the name of that book again that you mentioned at first? That King
Well,
Lover,
oh, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
King Warrior Magician Lover. Yeah, that's an example of facets of wholeness, but it's not all four of all the four kinds. Um, so um, I ended up mapping the human psyche onto what maybe you were referring to earlier as the medicine wheel, but um, our work at Animas is not drawn at all from indigenous traditions, but from our own Western mystery traditions. But what we find all through the world is that intact cultures have mapped wholeness onto nature's template. And there's three particular templates, which are all natural templates, which are all basically point to the same kind of meanings. And those are the four seasons, the four cardinal directions, and what we experience in the natural world in each of the four directions. And third, the four times of day: sunrise, noon, sunset, and midnight. So some people, when they think of indigenous traditions, refer to this as the medicine wheel, but more generally, it's nature's template. So the four facets of wholeness, um, we at Animas think of them in terms of the four cardinal directions. In the north, we have what we call the nurturing generative adult. Nurturing generative adult, which is um, the facet of our wholeness that's capable of self-healing, among other things, but also capable of nurturing others, and also capable of mature leadership um, and um, creative manifestation of one's true work in the world or one's true way of being. And in the East, we have what we call the innocent sage, or the innocent slash sage. And the East has a lot of paradox about it, and it's both innocent and wise. That's why innocent slash sage. There's both wisdom and an innocent capacity to be fully present to the world.
Hmm.
And in the South is what we call the wild indigenous one. Indigenous, not referring to any other native traditions, but to the fact that we're all every human is a natural creature of that's indigenous to this planet Earth. And the wild indigenous one, this is the South facet, um, is somatically very alive, loves being embodied, loves its particular body, loves all emotions. There's no such thing as a toxic emotion to the wild indigenous one. There are toxic emotions as far as our wounded parts are concerned, but not to the South facet. And in the South facet of us feels its natural kinship with all creatures of the world and all habitats, and feels just fully natural and animate participant in the greater Earth community.
Mm-hmm.
And in the West, we have the facet we call the dark muse beloved. So this is the inner beloved. This is the part of ourselves that we tend to project onto outer lovers when we're less mature. Part of maturing is to realize I've got this inner lover inside, and my relationship with him, her, them is related to and supportive of, but different than my relationship with an other romantic partner. And though this West facet is also the home of our deepest imagination, or our muse, and loves the darkness, not darkness the way we think of it in the contemporary mainstream Western world as evil or bad, but dark is this fruitful wholeness that contains all the resources that we need but haven't embraced yet. So it's the spiritual unknown that's so essential to our lives. So again, that's very brief, but that's a lot. But
Mm.
these four facets of wholeness, um, and two of them in particular, the West and the South, which is the dark muse beloved and the wild indigenous one, are actively suppressed by contemporary education models, religious models, and so on. And so there's a lot of work to do to uncover and re-embrace these essential parts of ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm getting a feel for the qualities of those four cardinal points. Curious about how you help people connect to them and start to embody them. Do you use certain practices for each cardinal point?
Yes, there's a whole set of practices, and we're learning new ones all the time. I should say that we haven't made up most of them. We've made up some practices, and we've modified ones we've learned. But these are kinds of practices you can find in the Western world, kind of on the edges of mainstream culture. I'll give examples in a moment. Um, but in our culture that's so oriented towards competition and proficiency and prowess and winning and being better than others and honing one's strengths, we tend to develop or cultivate the facets that we're already naturally somewhat strong at.
Hmm.
And we leave out the other ones, which tend to be the most important ones. The weaker ones are the most important ones for us to actually go through this journey of soul initiation. So that's why a map is so important, because again, in the Western world, we tend to identify our strengths and then keep building on them. And then we end up being kind of lopsided and not fully developed. So yeah, there's quite a few kinds of practices. Um, like on the inner world, we do lots with dream work, because often in our dreams, these facets of wholeness will show up disguised as various characters, and then we can be in relationship to them and develop our communication, our rapport with them. And also we use, again, inner world, deep imagery journeys. But much of our work is nature-based in terms of the the world outside our four walls. And so a lot of our practices have to do with wanders on the land. And there's some particular kinds of practices that help us develop each of these four different facets. Like the nurturing self, we might help develop that by learning how to praise the beings and the habitats, the landscape of the world, and learning how to tend to the land
Hmm.
in various kinds of ways. Um, and the East facet, uh, traditional contemplative arts, meditation practices, and so on, can help quite a bit. But also developing our sense of humor and our inner trickster. There's a variety of practices for that. These are just a few examples. And the South is a lot of body-based experiences of learning to embrace all of the feelings and emotions that are somatically based. And for a lot of work, a lot of people, there's a lot of trauma work that's involved, um, because what we do with overwhelming experiences in general is if we're not able to assimilate them, then we protect ourselves from those emotions and the associated somatic feelings. And so we have to learn to befriend the body again.
Mhm.
And learning how to communicate with other human beings through feeling and imagination are very kind of central practices that we use quite regularly. And in the West facet, we do a lot of dream work, helping people be in relationship to their own deepest imagery. And again, the deep imagination and practices, again, the practices of talking across the species boundaries, which is a term from Gary Snyder. Communicating with the others are practices we use quite a bit.
Mhm.
That's just a brief, very partial kind of example of the kind of practices.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks. Um, I guess maybe the next question for me then, you mentioned something about the true adult, and the north node that you're describing is the generative adult. Um, could you speak a little bit about that? Because, like you mentioned in the latest book, there's a lot of talk about how we're lacking true elders in our Western societies. But you take it a step further and say, actually, we're lacking a lot of true adults. So I can see how that might be confrontational to a lot of people.
Yeah,
People who are in
yeah,
their middle age go, "What do you mean? I'm an
yeah,
adult. I've got a mortgage. I've got a job. I've got kids.
yeah.
What more do you want from me?" So could you unpack that and talk about why that's important to you?
Yeah, thanks. The first thing is I'll invite all of us to take a deep breath on this one because it is quite a leap from our mainstream conventional Western maps. So maybe the first, maybe perhaps somewhat comforting thing to say is that that the understanding of maturity or true adulthood that we use at Animas is completely off Western maps. So we're not calling people immature by Western standards. Most everybody, I would imagine everybody who's listening to this podcast would rate as quite mature by Western standards. But, and here's where it starts getting a bit radical, is to say that um, the kind of our Western ideas of maturity is what I would consider a healthy early adolescent. And by early adolescence, I don't mean the first half of our teen years. I mean this stage, the psycho-spiritual stage of life that starts at puberty. And tragically, for most contemporary people, never ends. No matter how long one lives, one still is in this psychological stage of early adolescence. And it's not our fault. It's because we've lost so many hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, the cultural practices that enable us to more deeply mature. So for me, a true adult, here's a three-part definition. A true adult is somebody who experiences their primary membership in the world as being in the larger Earth community. Like that's my primary membership and participation, that I am a innate native member of this larger Earth community of many species and habitats and so on. And my religion, if I have one, or my spiritual practice, my ethnicity, my family identity, my job, and so forth are all really important, colorful parts of what make me the particular kind of human I am. But none of them are my primary membership. It's primarily that I'm an earthling. And that's not just a concept for a true adult, it's an embodied experience. You can say we become transcultural in a certain sense,
Hmm.
reach true adulthood. But that's the first of three parts. So, a true adult is someone who experiences their membership first and foremost in the Earth community, and secondly, has had one or more revelatory experiences of their unique place in that Earth community. The unique, that's what I mean by soul. And third, a true adult is someone who has created ways to embody that unique way of participating in the larger Earth community as a gift to that larger community, including our fellow humans. So another way to say it, one of my favorite shorthand phrases for a true adult is a visionary artisan of cultural regeneration.
Hmm.
Visionary. True adults are visionaries. Their lives are rooted in revelatory or visionary experience of their soul, of their unique place in the world. And they're artisans. They're people who've learned how to craft a way of being in the world, which embodies their true place as a gift, as a giveaway to the larger world. And doing that without necessarily trying to independently is a contribution to cultural regeneration. For a culture like ours that needs to regenerate, it's about cultural regeneration.
Mm-hmm.
For healthier cultures, we would just call it cultural evolution, or
Right. Or preservation, maybe.
absolutely. For so many indigenous people, it's preservation. Yes.
Yeah. Ooh, I love it. The fur stood up on my neck when you were describing that because to me, it sounds like a real call to action for everybody.
It is, yeah. What we need in the world now more than anything are true adults. In some ways, what we need more than anything are true, healthy adolescents, because a healthy adolescent is somebody who, among other things, experiences their innate belonging in the more than human community. So, healthy adolescents are what at Animas we call ecologically awakened, or shorthand eco awakened. And an eco awakened person is someone who experiences their 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 animal body participation and their kinship with all the other creatures of the world, not just healthy early adolescence.
Right. Like the wild child that is being tamed in our current culture.
Yeah, exactly. So eco awakening is in some ways reawakening because we're all born as wild children who who all children in early childhood um, find it completely natural. We all did find it completely natural to speak to the others, to speak to the birds and the grasshoppers and the rabbits and the trees. Um,
And
and
to be naked, playing in the mud, having these conversations with the world around you and even your invisible friends. Man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our educational and cultural systems and religious systems suppress that very early in life. So an eco-awakened person is someone who's actually just reawakened to their natural belonging to this world.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, when we name that, it it touches my heart, and I feel quite a bit of grief, actually.
Yeah.
So when you're doing the work at Animas Valley, is grief like grieving what we've lost or what's been suppressed? Is that a integral part of the work?
It is, absolutely. We didn't suspect it. I didn't suspect it in the very early years, but it turns out grieving is as much a part of the actual experience of being on an animus immersion as anything else. And it's for reasons you mentioned, Brian, that as we begin to come alive to the world and to ourselves and our own bodies and our relationship with um, all our relatives, as Indigenous people say, which is to say, all the other beings. There's this wonderful, arousing aliveness that we experience, but at the same time, we realize, oh, this is what I've been missing for
Yeah.
so long. And this is what my people are missing. And this is what my society is missing. And this is bedrock cause to all the problems and crises in the world now. And so sometimes people feel the biggest and strongest grief of their lives as they're starting to come alive and reawaken. And so in the early years, we had to start adjusting, like, how do we hold this grief that shows up as we're beginning to cultivate our human wholeness? And how do we say yes to it? And one of the things, of course, we learn is that pretty soon on is that grief and love live in the same place in our heart. They're in the same room. And if you won't open the door to grief, you're not going to open the door to love, the deeper love as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It reminds me of what Martin Prechtel talked about as grief and praise being like the wings
Totally.
of the same bird. You
Yes,
just can't
very
have one
much.
without the other, because if you love something, you're going to either be away from it at some point or you're going to lose it altogether. It goes hand in hand. And, I know that feeling, like when you start to have this awakening, it's like, the first response might be, "Oh my God, this is amazing." The second response for me is like, "Oh God, I've been missing this all that time." And I
Yes.
look around and I go, "Oh my God, I don't see it happening in the schools or in people's families or in the wider culture." And it's like, oh. And, that's where despair can come in, I think, because you see the way dominant culture is suppressing this in the smallest of children from day one, putting the shoes on the kid, putting the kid in the car seat, putting a screen in front of the kid. And it's like, God, how do we combat this? You know?
Yeah. Yep. And when you mention despair, I always think of the extraordinarily important work of Joanna Macy, one of our true great earth elders alive in the Western world now. And her work that she calls the work that reconnects, which she originally called something like 40 years ago, despair and empowerment work.
Hmm.
Despair and empowerment. And what one of the many things Joanna teaches us is that um, the two go together, despair and empowerment, that we won't feel fully empowered and ready and motivated to help improve our world unless we can also open to our despair and our grief. And it might be tempting to say, well, okay, we do despair and then we can move on to empowerment. But one of Joanna's lessons is that in the world as it is today, especially, we will never get past our despair.
Hmm.
Anybody who's paying any attention to what's happening in the world or even their local communities know there's so much tragedy and atrocities taking place everywhere that if we're paying attention, offering our attention, and being fully alive to ourselves and our emotions, despair is going to be part of our everyday experience. And because of that, empowerment will be part of our everyday experience, our readiness and our deep, deep motivation to make a difference and to give of our life to help enhance, at least sustain life, but ultimately to enhance it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the only response that's going to get you out of bed, when you wake up to that despair. Either you shut down completely or you just try to avoid it altogether through distraction or addiction. Or you go, okay, well, if not me, then who? So I got to figure out what I can contribute to improve things, to move things forward, to repair
Yeah,
things. It's the only way.
yeah, beautifully said. But I'll add one thing that gets into the heart of the work we do at Animas, that in a healthy adolescence, again, I don't mean our teen years, I mean in the pre-adult stage, which again, I've offered a definition earlier about adulthood. Um, in in a healthy adolescence, we do have to, what you say is correct, we have to figure out what we can do today or more generally this year or in my life to lessen the destruction of life and to begin to help create the infrastructure for healthier societies. But when we go through the journey of soul initiation, we're no longer figuring it out. It's not a journey of the strategic mind.
Right.
We're discovering the person, if you will, that we were born to be. And that discovery can't happen through the strategic mind, can't help happen through figuring out. It's something that we become the raw material. Our egos, our conscious self, become the raw material of that transformative journey. And our egos, start getting worked on by the soul, by the mystery, and we ourselves get reshaped. So it's not the ego that heroically figures it out
Right.
on the journey of soul initiation. It's the healthy adolescent ego that gets shapeshifted, that gets reformed into an adult ego.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the signs that we can listen for that the soul is moving us in a particular direction toward our soul's purpose or toward our unique eco niche?
Yeah, great question. Earlier in life, especially in adolescence, we become aware that something we might call the soul is guiding us. It's helping us. It's giving us hints of what to do and who to be in relationship with, and what communities to form alliances with that will help us do our growing, our holing, the cultivation of our natural wholeness and our healing, our self-healing. So the soul in the first half of life, which is to say childhood and adolescence, the soul is kind of like a guardian angel, and it's giving us little clues of who to be in relationship and what to do with our lives and where to live. Like when I was in my adolescence, in my 20s, the soul began to send me dreams about where I was to live. And actually, sometimes there were maps, like maps of the four corners, which is where I live now. Or someone would tell me about the work that someone else was doing, like the work of Stephen Foster and Meredith Little, who were two of my early teachers. And something would go, just a light would go on, or a body rush would go on, just hearing their names, like, I've got to find out what these people are doing. And that's the soul providing us some guidance. And then when we, a major life passage that, again, most contemporary people never go through, maybe only 10 or 20%, is the passage from what I call early adolescence to late adolescence. My other words for those stages are the oasis, that's early adolescence, to the cocoon, that's late adolescence. The cocoon is, of course, a place where there's a very radical transformation of being for caterpillars and for humans as well. Metaphorically, of course, for humans. And the passage between those two stages I call confirmation. And again, the cocoon stage, which is a healthy culture, considered late adolescence, is the stage where the journey of soul initiation takes place. So in that confirmation stage, I want to say some things about what we're experiencing. And we could say soul is helping us out, or giving us certain signs at that point. But in particular, during confirmation, keep in mind that's the end of the oasis of early adolescence. And early adolescence doesn't end until we've succeeded at the tasks of that stage. And simply put, the task of early adolescence is to develop a social presence or a persona that is both authentic to who you really are, to your true values and interests and so on, and emotions, and also um, socially accepted, which is to say socially successful.
Mm.
So you've developed a version of yourself, at least one version of yourself that is authentic and works socially in your peer group. And that's exactly the task that most people have trouble with
Yeah.
because of developmental problems from childhood. It's hard to be authentic.
Well, okay, let's just take a little pause there
Okay.
and invite people to take another deep breath, because what you're calling early adolescence is where I meet a lot of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s,
Yes.
trying to figure out, how can I be more authentic? How can I be myself in my family and my job and my culture? You know, Krishnamurti had that great phrase that everybody loves to repost, that it's no sign of a healthy individual to be adapted to a sick society, something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
So that combination of authenticity and healthy attachment is often severed really early on. We learn
Yes.
to suppress our authentic self to get along in our family, and then in our school, and then in the workplace. And then we wake up sometime, hopefully, we wake up at midlife and go, wait a minute, this isn't me, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, wow, that's a big task in itself, is to find, how can I be myself and still get along in the world I was born into?
Totally. Yeah. And well said. And what we've found at Animas, and a lot of what we've been doing for 40 years, is developing maps and practices to help people reach that level of authenticity and social acceptance. And it's really not that hard to do once you have the maps that identify the particular work that you need to do as an individual, and you have practices for doing it. It's not, it really isn't rocket science. It just underscores to what a degree our contemporary cultures suppress natural human development. So just to give you a few ideas, is one of the things that happens in a healthy early childhood is that we are mirrored by others accurately for who we are, because we are individuals even right after birth or before birth. And mirroring um, is, the basis of forming healthy attachment. And healthy parents can mirror their kids. They're not trying to make their kids into anybody else other than who that child is born to be. But so many of us were not mirrored in a healthy way. And so we need to have that experience later in life. And a talented psychotherapist can do that. Um, and even a healthy group therapy setting, or just more generally, not even therapy, but a healthy group. So one thing we practice is at Animas Valley Institute, like many groups these days, is the art of counsel. And part of what happens in counsel is that everybody has a chance to speak and speak authentically and to be mirrored by
Oh,
others.
okay. So you mean counsel with a C, not counsel as in counseling?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Counsel, CONCIL.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. COUNCIL.
Yeah. Well, Carl Rogers thought that that was so important and so necessary that he made that his whole approach to therapy, pretty much, is mirroring.
Yeah, it's such an essential piece. There's so much else that needs to happen, but
Sure. Yeah.
that's an essential
But
piece.
crucial, right? Crucial.
Yes, it is crucial. Another example is in middle childhood, roughly for most people, age 4 to 12. What we call at Animas, what we call the nature-based task of middle childhood, is to learn the enchantment of the natural world,
Mm.
is to discover one's natural way of belonging to this larger earth community. And the the technique, um, so to speak, of doing that is called playing outside,
Yeah.
not being supervised, but playing with other kids outside, and not particular games, but just playing with with mud and sticks and building things and pretending and learning the other animals, and which is to say learning how to imitate them. That's what
Mm.
natural children just naturally do. And by doing that, we come to just to experience ourselves at home, not just in our family, but also in the larger Earth community. And if we don't have that experience in middle childhood, then there's a certain kind of not at homeness that we feel at our center. There's a certain kind of restlessness, a certain kind of
Mm.
anxiety, a certain sense of not belonging. So even in our conscious minds, when we're like teenagers and later, we might say to ourselves, the important thing in belonging is with my peer group, and with the cultural scene and so forth, and the current style and music and dance and so forth, my gender identity. But even if we succeed at those forms or realms of belonging, we're not going to feel truly at home in the world if we don't also feel at home as a natural creature in a larger Earth community. And that's what so many people are missing, that we can do therapy forever that has to do with being able to generate acceptance socially, which is so important. It's absolutely essential. But if we don't also feel experience ourselves somatically fully at home in this greater, more than human world, we will always have this restlessness.
Mm.
So that's just
Yeah.
another example of what we need to do. And it's not hard. It's just that we need the models and the practices to help ourselves do that.
Yeah. Thanks. One of the things I find interesting about your work is you've got a unique definition of soul. You talk about it as our eco niche, and we've mentioned it a couple times, but it might be helpful if you go into that a little bit so you can help people understand what you mean.
You bet. Um, yeah, sometimes people think I've changed the subject. I'm not talking about what people usually mean by soul. And I'm definitely not talking about soul as in the religious, Western religious context of some metaphysical thing that comes into the body at some point before birth and leaves when we die. Not that sense of soul at all. And I'm also not talking about soul as more or less a synonym for the psyche or for the mind or the fact that we have consciousness. Those are other uses of the word soul. But a very, very common uh, connotation of the word soul is um, that which gives us our deepest meaning, or our deepest belonging, or deepest sense of aliveness. And I've come to understand that what gives us our deepest sense of meaning is the unique place in the larger Earth community that we were born to take, which is to say our ecological niche. So maybe a bit defensively, I like to say, no, I haven't really changed the topic at all. I've placed soul back in the place where I believe it ultimately belongs, which is in this larger natural world. That soul, you might say, is what is most natural about anything. So in this definition of soul, everything has a soul, because everything is created or is born to take a unique place in this larger symphony of life. So, but one of the places that it becomes difficult is that when we just look at the science or the discipline of ecology, what we are reminded of very quickly is that a niche, a thing's or a creature's niche, is its set of relationships with everything else in its ecosystem. It's this web of relationships. And for any given thing, that's web of relationships is so complicated, so complex, that you can't literally describe it. You can identify certain features of it, like the niche of a fox has to do with, the particular ways that it hunts. And we recognize its cunning. And the niche of everything has to do with the way it serves life, because everything on our planet or in the cosmos that's alive, and some would say everything is alive, is designed to serve life. That life enhances life.
Mm-hmm.
And so to know our niche is to know the way we are designed or born to enhance life. But when a person has what I call a soul encounter, which is an experiential glimpse or vision of their unique echo niche, it's not a literal description of that would seem to be in the realm of ecology. That the way we humans, the way our consciousness interprets or frames or experiences our unique echo niche is through metaphor, through poetry or symbol or archetypes or dream images. So the way our ego consciousness begins to learn about our unique echo niche is through a metaphor, something mythic or poetic. And so at Animas, we've adopted this term mythopoetic identity.
Mm.
Mythopoetic identity. It's the way I consciously understand my ecological niche. So for me, I've had four, depending on how you count, 4 or 5 soul encounters in my life. And my first one, which is when I was 30 years old, was at the end, I was on the 4th day of the 4-day vision fast that I took myself out into the wilderness for in the Colorado mountains when I was 30. And on that 4th day, I had a conversation with a spruce tree and a yellow butterfly who were interacting. And the yellow butterfly flew to me and actually brushed the left side of my face with her wings. And as she went by, I heard in English the words cocoon weaver. And that just won't sound like a common everyday experience to the most mainstream Westerners. But after 4 days of fasting and engaging in a variety of practices and ceremonies, our consciousness shifts radically. And that's not an unusual experience to have. And this image of weaving cocoons, I soon came to understand was what my life was about, that I was born to be someone to help myself and others weave cocoons of transformation from psychological adolescence to true adulthood. So that was my first glimpse of mythopoetic identity. And it points to my unique ecological niche, but notice that it doesn't identify a vocation or a social role.
Mm.
Because I think, as I said towards the beginning of our podcast here, that soul identity or soul purpose is ecologically based. It's not socially or vocationally based. That and each one of us, after soul encounter, eventually needs to choose one or more jobs, or more generally social roles, for embodying our mythopoetic identity. But those roles or jobs or careers are what we call at Animas delivery systems for our mythopoetic identity. So I've been a psychotherapist, psychologist more generally, a Soulcraft guide, a Vision Fast guide, an author, and a few other jobs, some of which I actually got paid for. But none of those is my sole purpose. None of those are my mythopoetic identity. They're delivery systems
Mm.
for weaving cocoons. Like, if you get to know me well, what you'll see me doing on one of my good days is weaving cocoons. Even though if someone asked you, well, what do you mean? What was he doing? You say, well, he was guiding this Soulcraft program, or he was mentoring somebody. But what he was actually doing, he was weaving cocoons. Um,
Yeah, I get it.
so maybe that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I think, first of all, thanks for that term because when I read it, I immediately got it.
Uh-huh. Great.
And
Yeah.
I think people will get it. Like I'm thinking of a woman who's a bus driver, thinking of herself as the mama bear, taking care of all the cubs, making sure they get home safely.
Hmm.
Even that has something of that mythopoetic identity, even if that woman isn't kind of doing soul work consciously or going on weekend workshops to come up with this. I think something like that can just emerge naturally, don't you think?
Yes, I think it can. I think it does. If we're in tune with our bodies and our emotions and our deepest longings and follow that deepest longing, we might go through this journey of soul initiation, even if we've never heard of such a thing, and even if there's no cultural support for it at all.
And
Uh,
if we haven't totally cut ourselves off from that, the Eastern node, the innocent sage, that kind of inner child who's open to the imaginal and has the mythic mind, if we haven't cut ourselves off from that, then these images could just spontaneously surface in our consciousness, right? Like, oh, I feel like the mama bear of all these little cubs, something like that.
yeah, yeah. In my new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, it's mostly just filled with stories of people going through the experience of the journey, in particular, that key part of the journey we call the descent to soul. And and I love these stories. That's one reason I focused on them in this book. But also, there's the stories implicitly and explicitly identify all the many different ways that people can experience this journey. Um, so, for example, you might have a um, a highly skilled um, pianist pianist who, when she's playing the piano, um, you could say in one level, well, she's playing this sonata or this tune, and but if you ask her what she's doing when she's playing that that music, she might say, "I'm praising God," and that's what, and I'm only doing well when I'm in that place of praising God, and that's what I'm really doing. It might look like I'm playing the piano, but I'm
So
praising God.
could you say her mythopoetic identity is the pianist who praises God, or would it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't always have to be like an animal image or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Not at all. Yeah.
So when I read that term and you telling the story about Cocoon Weaver, um, I got in a flash this experience that I had. So maybe I think I'd just like to share that to kind of add to the well of stories. And also maybe it helps people understand the term a little better. So when I heard that, I immediately thought of an ayahuasca ceremony that I was in a number of years ago down in Peru. And I think, my descent to soul was over the course of many years. When I was, I had the kind of typical midlife crisis. I had climbed the corporate ladder, realized the ladder was against the wrong wall, and went, God, how did I get here?
Hmm.
And then went on this, what I can now call a descent into soul to try to discover, well, what is my eco niche? What am I here for? What kind of adult do I actually want to be? How do I want to contribute? So as part of that, I did a lot of plant medicine work. And in one of these ceremonies, I had the vision of myself as a bumblebee, specifically a worker bee, who is going out and gathering up medicine to bring back to the hive. And it really struck me because I realized that was what I had been called to do, and that's what I had been doing. I traveled all over learning from senior yoga teachers in a particular tradition to try and get the essence of what they got from their teachers, and then bring it back and teach it in my local community. And I did the same with music and traveled all over collecting these different medicine songs and bring them back and offer them up into circles. Um, and I realized, well, that seems like something I'm uniquely suited for. I have this intense curiosity about the deep aspects of life. I have ever since I was a little kid. I came out of the womb reading, and I immediately started to read fantasy books, getting into spirituality in my early teens and doing that whole exploration. So it seems like it's something I'm especially suited to, just following my curiosity, going out and gathering things up, and then bringing them back, trying to synthesize them and offer them back to the community as a kind of medicine. And having that image, it really struck me, and it just kind of landed in my heart as if there was already an imprint of that image there. And it was like, that's who I am. That's my job.
Yep.
Enough so that I came back and I got a tattoo of it on my wrist to like always remind me, this little worker bee.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought it was a really nice synchronicity that my name is Brian, and people who know me well often just call me B.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I was reading your book and I was talking to my wife on our walk, and I was like, this is such a great idea, this mythopoetic identity. And I, said, and it reminded me of that whole experience I had in the jungle. And then she reminded me that when I was 8, I had a near-death experience because I was attacked by a giant swarm of bees. And I was out in the woods with some other kids, and we were crossing a creek going over a log, and I guess there was a nest under the log. I was the littlest one. I was the last to go over, and I got the swarm. All the other kids ran off screaming, and I didn't know which way was up. I didn't know where to go. I was just trying to fight off the swarm. And our friends whose cottage it was had a big black standard poodle named Toro. And Toro waited for me, and he would bark, and I would just kept following his bark. And then I would, be all discombobulated, and he would just stop, bark, make sure I was following him. And he led me all the way back to the cottage where all the adults were like, oh my God, here he is. And just started to take care of me after that. But I had to be rushed to a hospital an hour away, and I went into shock and had to have adrenaline and all this, right? Very intense experience. But coming full circle, this mythopoetic identity, the worker bee. Oh my God, it seems like I was initiated by the bees when I was a little kid or something. It's just this incredible resonance across time that feels really meaningful to me, and it does give me a sense of guidance. Like it's something I can always track back to. Even doing this podcast, I'm kind of seeking out elders and teachers around the world, talking to them, trying to get to the essence of their medicine, and then sharing it with the people who listen to the podcast. That's still kind of doing my worker bee job.
Yes. What a beautiful story. Yeah. Thank you for that, B. That's a beautiful story. And it's a very illustrative of the various aspects of the journey of soul initiation. It's clearly a mythopoetic identity for you, or part of your identity. I say part only because sometimes we have additional soul encounters that further differentiate an identity. And it guides you as to what's really worth doing, what way you can be of the greatest value to the world. And your story also illustrates a common theme or pattern I've discovered. I'm not the only one who's discovered it in soul initiation journeys. And that is what becomes our medicine and is often associated with what could kill us, or almost maybe did kill us when we were younger. So you were almost killed by those bees. So when we're younger, we sometimes, I don't know if this is true for your story, but sometimes we protect ourselves from the very phenomena or um, symbols that later turn out to be at the heart of our mythopoetic identity. One of the stories in my new book is of a woman who's a healthcare provider who actually lives on Vancouver Island.
Hmm.
And she uh, was always horrified by the act of hunting. Um, she just felt it was cruel. And of course, the way it's done in the contemporary Western world, it often is cruel, not always. There are some hunters who hunt in a sacred way, but there's a lot of trophy hunters in the contemporary world. And this woman, whose name is Christy, was always quite horrified by that. And her story of soul initiation is quite remarkable. So I think is to say it's one of the amazing stories in the book. But what she slowly discovered was that her mythopoetic identity had everything to do with hunting.
Hmm.
And boy, did she resist that every way possible. But that through dreams, through chance encounters, um, and through what we call soulcraft practices, she kept getting confronted with the fact that at the very heart of her soul, if you will, was this act of hunting. But it was a sacred kind of hunting, and it wasn't literally hunting so much, although that turned out to be part of it too. And she gradually started saying yes to the huntress of herself. That showed up in various ways, including the archetype of Artemis.
Hmm.
But among other things, she took a 2-week course and she learned how to make her own longbow and then her own arrows. Um, and then after many months, how to begin to shoot those arrows. And then she began being stalked by literal flesh and blood bears. And then she actually got her hunting license with a special tag to hunt bear with bow and arrow. But all during this time, she's also learning what the mythological and the deeper symbolic significance of hunting, and in particular, what it is to hunt um, the the heart, and the heart in herself and the heart in other humans, and what it is to pierce that heart with a symbolic arrow and so forth.
Hmm.
So this is just meant to be an example of what we're most afraid of when we're younger, or what almost killed us when we were younger, turns out to be the very essence of our soul identity. And it's not really surprising because the ego, the adolescent ego, is terrified of soul. It's what the adolescent ego most longs for and is most terrified by, because there's parts of us that know that if we're going to surrender to this deepest longing, that everything we thought we were and everything we thought the world was is going to crumble. And
Yeah.
so it's this amazing tension of it's what we're terrified of, or it's what we most deeply long for.
Well, another aspect that's terrifying to the adolescent is living up to the responsibility, uh, responding to what the soul, what the world is asking of you. It's the last thing an adolescent wants. The adolescent is looking out for themselves, right?
Yeah, yeah, looking out for themselves. Well, the healthy adolescent is also wanting to contribute to their social group and so forth. But
Yeah, but even that is rare, as we talked about, you know?
even that is rare. It's sadly true.
Yeah, we've got a lot of older people out there who are just looking out for themselves and trying to just live up their golden years.
Yep,
You know?
it really is quite tragic. And once we really get that, there's a lot of grief that is really good to have. I mean, that deep grief stretches our heart.
It's honest too, right?
It's absolutely honest. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think I love the kind of the boldness of what you're saying and what that book is about, and in naming some of these things. It's like, personally, I just kind of go, oh, thank God someone is like speaking directly to some of these things, because I don't hear a lot of it. I think it takes some courage to do that and a willingness to take a few slings and arrows yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, where did I want to go next? I mean, just that, thinking about how us humans are in a really kind of unique position in this ecology. We're probably the only creature who doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing. I was having my morning coffee on the deck, and we've got a cherry tree just outside. It's starting to produce fruit, and I'm watching like the little birds come up and peck at the sour cherries, and that cherry tree knows exactly what it's here to do. It's here to produce fruit, produce flowers, uh, probably produce shade. It's probably nurturing the soil around it. The little bird knows exactly what it's meant to do. It's eating its fruit, it's spreading seeds, it's doing all the bird stuff. And here we are, and we're expected to choose or to figure out what it is we're supposed to be doing. And we've got other things to consider. We're the only creature who has to pay rent to live on this earth, most of us. And I have a lot of grief around that, and I know a lot of people are carrying some unnamed grief around that we can't just live, that we have to earn our living, more than just sustenance, going out and hunting or harvesting, that kind of thing. um, so we're in this really unique and kind of terrible position. So what do we do, considering that a lot of us can't be following our soul's purpose, to make money, to pay rent and buy food and all of that? How do we? I know you make a distinction between the soul purpose and the social purpose, but that can be really soul destroying for some people to have to do work that is so not in alignment with what their maybe unconscious soul purpose is or what their conscious soul purpose is. Do you know where I'm going with this? So how do you suggest people navigate that? I mean, does everyone who kind of wakes up to their soul's purpose have to change their job and find a meaningful vocation?
Yeah. Well, there's maybe two parts here implicitly. One is, what do we do while we're learning to cultivate our natural human wholeness and um, succeeding at the task of psychological early adolescence? What do we do meanwhile? And for most people, you have to have something that we call a survival job to do it. And that's part of the difficulty and the reality for most people of the contemporary world. It will probably be some generations in the future before that will change, or that actually can begin changing, in our lifetimes. But maybe just begin changing, and that's a reality. But once we realize how the contemporary cultures suppress the development of our natural wholeness and succeeding at the task of both childhood and adolescence, then we can start addressing those things and make that cultivation of our human wholeness a priority while we're surviving, paying rent and so forth in whatever way we need to. But primarily, Brian, I do hear the larger or the main focus of your question, which is for those who have had a soul encounter. What do they do then? What does the person do then. When you know what your soul wants to do, like in my case, weaving cocoons, or in yours, um, delivering the honey medicine to others. Um, at first, we're still in that position where we have to have a survival job. It doesn't literally have to be a job. We have to have some kind of survival, what we call a survival dance.
Hmm.
And for some, it's living in Hawaii and living off the land and not being part of the monetary economy. Or for some people, it's being supported by their parents in order to pay rent. Or for other people, it's a job they work a day or two a week at, and that's enough. For others, it's a full-time job, or maybe two full-time jobs. They need to pay the rent, and if they have children and a partner and so forth, or elderly parents, they might have to work a job or more to support everybody. So that's the survival dance. But once you've had an encounter with your soul, which is to say, a revelation of your mythopoetic identity, then you begin to walk in the world as that person, as that identity. And that's what in the book I refer to as the fourth of 5 phases of the descent to soul. The third phase being the encounter with soul, which is to say the revelation of mythopoetic identity. And the fourth being what I call metamorphosis, this essential phase of the journey that, for example, Joseph Campbell completely missed in the hero's journey, and is something it's not part of a rite of passage. But the metamorphosis is this phase of the journey in which your mythopoetic identity starts doing its shape-shifting work on your ego, and your ego gets shape-shifted over a period of months, sometimes years, into a state where it can actually begin to embody its mythopoetic identity as a gift to the people. And it takes some time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've gotten through that phase of metamorphosis and your ego is actually ready to deliver your gift to the world, then you have to create a delivery system. Choose and cultivate and hone a delivery system, usually by studying with a master of a particular craft whose delivery system would resonate with your own. And that takes some time. But developing that delivery system is what we call a sacred dance. So for people soon after, in the year or 2 or 3 or 4 after a soul encounter, they're going to have 2 dances. They're going to have a survival dance and a sacred dance. And eventually, what the teachings from the wisdom traditions tell us, and I believe it is true, is that as we're learning our sacred dance, which is, say, our delivery system, and we get better at it, it becomes incredibly valuable to our community, to our people. And our people will find ways to support us to do that, so that to do it more and more full time. So we don't need a separate survival dance in order to do our sacred dance, which is to say, our sacred dance becomes our survival dance. They become one and the same thing. We get supported economically or socially and otherwise to provide this life-enhancing gift to our community.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because if you're actually in your eco niche, then it will be supported by the ecology, which is like your community and the place and all that stuff, right?
Exactly.
So
Yep.
you know you're in your eco niche when you're finding that support, that it's feeling a need from in the community at large. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. And the community will want you to do that more and more, and they'll find a way to support you to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate that you recognize the reality of the situation that most people are in. It's not as simple as following your bliss
It
or
isn't. Yeah.
finding your purpose and going for it and manifesting. uh, it's a lot more complex than that. We have some real world things that we need to take care of while we also, like you said, get into that sacred dance.
We we have these parts of ourselves that we call inner protectors or subpersonalities. And they don't want us to go on the journey of soul initiation, even if we're in the stage of life where it's possible, because they're afraid of the um, apple cart of our lives being overturned. Um, so they want us to settle. If we're on to something like the journey of soul initiation, if we've discovered what it is, our inner protectors, sometimes we call them subpersonalities, they want us to settle. They will say, yeah, just follow your bliss. That's enough. Or I figured out a job that feels truly fulfilling. That's great. Yep, stay with that. Um, because the inner protectors know that if we really start the descent to soul, it's going to be an experience of dying, of dismemberment, uh, and of what we call that the dissolution phase or dismemberment phase. And our inner protectors want to protect us from that experience. And so they'll try to get us to settle and not go on the deeper journey. And there's a lot of programs and approaches in the Western world today that come under the general banner of finding our purpose, um, which is really, they're really helping people find their social or vocational purpose, which is really important for people in early adolescence. But for people in the cocoon stage, that could be just a distraction because we're being called to this much deeper set of questions about that requires us to surrender completely everything we thought about who we were going to be in the world and go through this dying experience of dissolution that is the necessary precursor to the encounter with soul.
Hmm. Yeah, what comes to mind too is that I think some of these protectors or subpersonalities aren't always so encouraging and positive. They might be saying, no, no, look, you got to make sure you pay the rent. So you need to just take that job. You know,
Exactly.
you can go to the weekend workshops once a year, you get a couple weeks off. You can do your retreats, but you got to like take care of things. You need stability, you need security, right?
Yeah, this uh, desire to discover your soul is just a distraction. It's just trying to keep you from your
Selfish.
responsibilities. It's totally selfish. Yeah.
But like what you're saying is that discovering what your soul purpose is, your eco niche, is actually a service to something greater than yourself. And it's going to be incredibly challenging. You know, I think for most, I don't know. For me, it was because this realization that my job was to be a worker bee came at a time when I was living in the Amazon and absolutely loving it. I loved being out of North American culture. I loved having ceremony regularly. I loved working with people who were coming from all over the world to this retreat center. I was in my total happy place. I was playing music all the time, Um, but what this vision was telling me was that no, no, no. Your job is not to hang out down here. Your job is to take it back to where you came from, where there's people who can't afford to come down here or can't come get the medicine themselves. You got to bring some of that back home. So you got to bring some of that, the music and things back home, right? And that wasn't easy to come back and
Yeah.
to try to make a life in North America where it's so expensive and there's, like I said earlier, they're widening the road out here to make more room for the commuters who are going into the city. And there's Costco going up, and it's just like so disheartening to live around here. And I live in one of the most beautiful places in North America, and
Yeah.
that dominant culture is totally effing things up.
Yeah.
So the soul's purpose is not really always selfish, right? Like,
It's never selfish.
yeah.
Yeah. It's always it's what provides our greatest service to the world and our own personal fulfillment, our greatest fulfillment. So you could say it's um, that for initiated adult, fulfillment and service are the same thing. You can't separate them anymore. And the experience you just spoke to so beautifully about leaving the Amazon, it sounds like the passage that we refer to as from late adolescence, which is the cocoon, to early adulthood, which we call the wellspring. And that passage we call soul initiation. That's different from the journey of soul initiation, which ends with the passage of soul initiation. And during that passage, what we essentially feel is happening is that we're getting kicked out of mystery school, this incredibly engaging, alluring,
Oh,
exciting
I just want
mystery
to stay
school.
in the mystery school. I want to stay in that
Totally.
learning position. There's no responsibility. You're just soaking it all up. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
totally.
at the passage of soul initiation, it's as if mystery is saying to you, mm-mm, you've got to actually go out in the world and do something with what you've gathered in the cocoon. And one of the patterns that I've discovered, and I'm sure healthy cultures will always say this, that whenever we move from one stage of life to the next, it's a terrible thing. There's a lot of grieving to do because every stage is the best stage of life to be in when you're in it.
Hmm.
And every stage is the worst stage to leave as you're leaving it. And so it's not a oh boy when you move from one stage to the next. It's a oh no. And the reason healthy cultures invented rites of passage is primarily to help people going from one stage of life to the next adapt and understand what this new stage of life, this new consciousness is that they're moving into, and to let the community know this person is moving into a new stage and they could use some support because they're going to be really disoriented and unhappy for a while
Yeah.
because they just left the best stage of life, whatever it
Well,
was.
they're often kind of dragged out of the nest or out of mom and dad's home, right? Like they don't
Yeah.
go willingly. So that's the first part of it. It's just to like
Yeah.
get that process, like kind of kickstart it.
Yeah.
But then, of course, support and hold them and all of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, a rite of passage actually celebrates and supports a passage that's always has already happened, which as opposed to this idea that I believe is mostly mistaken, that a rite of passage moves you from one stage to the next. No, you already go through the passage, and then the elders recognize that's what's happening for you, and then you have a rite of passage to help you adapt to the new stage.
Mm, yeah. Like, oh, Brian's got some hair in his armpits now. Like, it might be time.
Yeah, for
Something's
puberty,
happening.
right?
It's
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I guess one of the other challenges we have is that there's no group of uncles coming and telling us it's time. It's time to go. You're coming with us. And so we've got to kind of self initiate that process for ourselves. And like you said, it's not going to lead you into more comfort. It's going to be really difficult and challenging. So that's yet another reason why this could, you know, never happen for some.
yep. That's right. Yep.
So, is part of the work, I guess, just talking about like you're writing books and you keep writing books, and I got to wonder, is part of that just increasing people's awareness of where they might be stuck, what's possible for them, and then offering some things as to what could help?
That's a good summary. Yeah. The maps and models we use at Animas are ones that help people understand where they are developmentally and what uh, inner psychological and spiritual resources need to be developed. And if they're going through the passage of confirmation into the cocoon, or they are already in the cocoon, what kinds of things they can do to support their journey, and what a true guide is. What what is the qualities that a guide has who actually understands the journey of soul initiation and who can support them through it, like those uncles or those aunties in a healthy culture, or those elders. Um, so, yeah, some of us can self-initiate, but others of us can at least recognize where we are and that could use some support. The descent to soul tends to go deeper and more effectively and less terrifyingly if you at least have a model that you understand what's happening to you, and in the best case scenario, you have a guide to help you through some of the rough spots.
Yeah, I can see how it could definitely help the process along. You know, and I think just for myself, um, I've relied so much on some of the mentors and teachers that I've met, and then also the peers who are going through similar experiences. It really helps to find the others and to find not even soul initiation guides or mentors, but people who are mentors in one of those areas that you feel called to apprentice in, or yeah. But for people who are interested in your approach and some of these maps and models, you offer, well, tell us about some of the offerings.
Yeah, you could find them all before I forget to say at www.animas.org. Animus is the Spanish word for souls. It's Animas,
Not
animus.
not animus, the masculine soul of
It's
Carl
not
Jung.
exact. It's not US at the end. It's AS.
Las animas. Yeah.
Um, yes, and so I might have mentioned earlier we have programs in North America, in Colombia and South America, in several countries in Europe, in New Zealand and Australia, and occasionally in the Middle East and probably other places I'm forgetting. But yeah, there's quite a few kinds of programs we offer. They include a very contemporary Western form of the pan-cultural vision fast, which are 12 to 14 days long, the way we do that ceremony with lots of preparation time and follow-up afterwards. We have a year-long experience that meets 4 times throughout the year that takes people through the whole process. We have probably at least 20 different kinds of programs. We have programs tend to be 5 days long on dream work, deep imagery work, counsel process. There's just to say many different kinds, all of which support the journey. Some of our introductory programs are called the Wild Mind Intensive, the Wild Mind Intensive, and the Soulcraft Intensive. And again, you can find them all on our website.
Yeah. There's a Wild Mind Intensive happening just up the road from me, actually.
Yes. Yeah, we've done quite a few programs on Vancouver Island.
So, for someone who's just getting into this work, uh, would you recommend the Wild Mind Intensive as a great place to start and get
It is
oriented?
yep, that or the Soulcraft Intensive is a great place, but we generally divide our programs into more or less introductory, which does not mean easy. They're all very intense. And the other programs we call advanced programs, and those require an application so that we can screen people and make sure that people are ready for the even more intense journeys. You wouldn't want to find yourself in our more advanced programs if you weren't ready. So if you get on our website, any of the non-advanced, which are the so-called, in quotes, introductory programs, would be great places to start.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for giving us your time and sharing so much. It's yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm happy you're out there. I'm happy I found you, and I listened to my friends after all those years saying, "You got to
Mhm.
check this guy out. I think there's something there that you'll appreciate."
Yeah,
So the new book's called Journey of Soul Initiation. I'm reading it now and really enjoying it. It just feels like a call to action. I feel like a boost of inspiration and clarity on what is needed most in our day and age. Yeah.
thanks, Brian, very much. Enjoyed the conversation with you. I love the surprising places that it branched off into.